Well, there hadn't been a substantial film about Bacon for a number of years, and the ones that had been made about him were obviously made whilst he was alive. And so they tended to focus much more on him as an individual, on his opinions, on interviews with him, and less than they could have done, I think, on the work itself. What we set out to try and achieve was a marriage between the work and the life, and trying to look at the ways in which they did connect, and the work did reflect what was going on emotionally, largely, in his life. And because his life sort of spanned most of the century, it was going to be also a film about the 20th century. There were areas of Bacon's early life in particular about which it was very hard to discover anything really. And even his sister, for example, didn't know what he did in Paris, where he studied, how he became a designer. Suddenly, he appears in London with a showroom full of furniture that he's designed. It's almost impossible to discover, how this came about, who funded it, where he'd studied. Some of his secrecy was quite clearly secrecy about things that he'd done that he didn't want people to know about, that he might have been ashamed of, like stealing, which he clearly did from time to time early on. And I think some of it was also to do with the fact that he was homosexual in a period where this was illegal, so that this kind of general culture of secrecy almost was quite common amongst homosexual men in this period. And other people didn't ask as well. It's quite extraordinary that his sister, for example, didn't know that he was gay until her husband told her. It wasn't something that she actually thought about. So there was this climate of secrecy. One of the things that was very striking was that he actually did form sustained and profound relationships, a number of them in his life, which didn't necessarily marry up with this very chaotic single character that he had always appeared to be. It became a sort of structure for the film, his relationships, because it became clear that he had about half a dozen proper relationships of different kinds during his life with different men, and they sort of coincided quite closely with different decades, so that it's almost like a new decade ends and a new lover appears. Now, these relationships also were very different. He began by, I think, being involved with men who were able to help him, so that Roy de Maistre quite clearly taught him a lot about art, even a lot about painting. Eric Hall was very wealthy, introduced him to the finer things in life, dining and also gambling and travel. And then in the 50s, he got involved with Peter Lacey, who was his contemporary. The other two had been older. And then Peter Lacey, he would later describe him as the love of his life, was a contemporary, and that was a much more violent encounter, much more difficult relationship, which almost destroyed them both, actually. And then I think after that, Bacon, who's now in his late 40s, 50s, sat back and then had these younger lovers.
What you're really saying is that what Wilde said, you kill the thing you love.
Well, I always knew that the central, as it were, the pivotal emotional event in his life was the death of George Dyer. I wanted to cluster as much different material around it as possible to increase its power.
Once I loved her, and I gave so much love to this love, it was the world to me.
Because it's a very shocking event. If you're watching the film and you don't know what's going to happen to George, then it's very shocking that this happens, as indeed it was very shocking at the time. But having a relationship with Bacon was really a pretty dangerous undertaking. George was completely out of his depth in these intellectual circles. Bacon was at the height of his fame and glory. You know, nobody except Picasso had ever had a one-man show. No living artist ever had a one-man show at the Grand Palais in Paris. I mean, this was massive. The president was going to be there. And then Bacon's reaction has been the source of much discussion, you know, that seemingly he went through with the whole thing, virtually ignoring the fact that this lover had committed suicide or died at that moment. So what does that say about him? Some people have accused him of being unfeeling and callous and selfish. And I think there's a sense of that from the interview that we did with his brother Lee.
Francis came in a limousine. He stood well in the background. But my brother knew he was there, my oldest brother Ron, and he got very uptight about it. And he wanted to confront Francis over this at his funeral. But my mother said, leave it, let it go. 37. Yes, he was 37. Quite a young man, really.
The kind of consequences for Bacon's work, given that George had been his principal model, were profound. And you know, it was clear from the way that we had told the story of that relationship with the pictures, the portraits of George, how important he was and how he'd come to sort of, you know, have this double role as lover and model. And the way that Bacon dealt with this massive emotional trauma was to sort of paint it, to exorcise it by painting it. But also, like many writers, you know, his life is his material in that sense. You know, they're not, generally speaking, inventions. So the death of George Dyer produced these phenomenal series of triptychs which replay the event in this incredibly, almost cinematic way. You know, they're like film in some way. You know, they're the way that you read these three images. I think he liked the anonymity of living in London. It has this cosmopolitan, anonymous, moving population, which he liked to kind of be lost in. He had his routines, and he didn't like change, and so it's always amazed people that, you know, even when his pictures were selling for millions, he still lived in this really tiny studio and flat in South Kensington, where he was able to, you know, to do this sort of alchemy, really, create these extraordinary images. There were lots of myths about Bacon. You know, that he was completely alcoholic, that his life was totally unmanageable. These were myths, and partially self-generated myths, to give him this sort of bohemian, exotic character. But I've always thought that he, and this became clearer as we made the film, that he was actually a much more organised character, very, very clear about his own importance and his own intelligence. And, you know, it's a solitary occupation, painting, a very solitary occupation. These periods, I think, were very intense, and often when he had done a whole lot of work and was maybe a little bit burnt out waiting for ideas, then he would spend a lot of time with his friends.
How long do you ever feel that you would ever retire?
Retire? You're joking. I'm going to retire. I hope to drop dead just working.
Wouldn't that be nice? But with the brush in your hand, and the last accidental slosh is as you fall.
Now, I'm not talking about anything so romantic as that. I just hope I shall go on working.
I remember, you know, the news that Francis Bacon had died suddenly in Madrid, and it was very unexpected. I mean, he was there visiting Jose. He, I think, had, according to his doctor, you know, his lung condition had deteriorated quite markedly. I mean, he had oxygen in the flat in London and things. But he was, you know, determined to go to Madrid. He was very fond of Jose. He liked being there. So he went to Madrid, and I think quite soon got into problems. But I think for the first couple of days he was fine. You know, they went outside of Madrid. I think they went to the Escorial, and then, you know, he wasn't feeling well, so he went to see a doctor, and the doctor erred on the side of caution and had him admitted to this very exclusive clinic, where he was nursed by nuns, which isn't that unusual in Spain, but ironic in terms of his, you know, atheism. And there was something very powerful about that room. It was you know, an ordinary hospital room, but the fact that one knew that this is where Bacon had died gave it this peculiar quality, and I think that was very appropriate, because his pictures are all about rooms. And the bed had a kind of tubular quality that reminded one of his own furniture. Then there was this little crucifix on the wall, you know, which reminded you of his own paintings of the crucifixion. So that there were all these elements that were very ordinary, but somehow very, very Bacon in their quality. And that was a good final moment, I think. It was a very sort of clean final moment in the film. You know, there wasn't an orchestra playing, and there weren't millions of people around. It was this very sort of singular, focused location that could be used in a very powerful way, I thought.